This is the Rich Dad Stockcast with Andy Tanner, the show that kicks 401ks in the asphalt and teaches you to be the master of your own stock investing domain. And here's your host, Greg Arthur.
Welcome to today's episode is about a four-letter word, so you might want to remove your children. You might want to even, if you're married, warn your spouse. But this is probably Robert Kiyosaki's favorite four-letter word. That word is debt.
Debt.
And debt, yes. We're going to talk about debt. Most people think of debt as in money. A very common second form of debt is when you're in debt to time. But that's not what we're talking about either. In fact, today, Andy is going to teach us a different kind of debt that's particular to stock trading. One that I actually just learned about today. And then we're going to take it to a third place where Andy is going to show you maybe something even better than debt. So I thought we should start with, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Let's talk about debt, man.
Let's do debt. Should we tell the audience what Robert's favorite four-letter word is, or should we just skip that?
No, I think we skip that one. We'll stick with debt.
We'll stay with okay. Let's stay with debt.
I do have kids. So.
That's too high. So to start, let's talk about the simple what everyone thinks of as debt and how it relates to the stock market, because one of the things the Rich Dad brand tends to misrepresent often is that you can't use debt to buy stocks. And so first, let's clarify that, and maybe Andy, give us a little bit of education on how that's done, and can a common person like myself do it, or does it have to be someone like you to do it? So let's start with the common stock debt.
Well, debt, even bigger picture than that, debt's really an important thing because it is a form of leverage. What is debt? It's an accelerator. It helps us do things faster. If I want to own something now and I don't have the money for it, I'm going to be using some type of debt or promise and raising capital. Raising capital, you can do it for equity or for debt. So it's a very important thing because in the compounding formula, money, rate, and time, a lot of people, if they didn't accelerate somehow, they would not be able to achieve their dreams. If someone's listening to this and they're my age, in their 50s, and they're just starting out, with nothing, getting going, to achieve a big dream, they'll have to learn probably to use some type of leverage and manage the risks associated with debt. So Robert is correct in that if I went down to the bank and I said, will you loan me $100,000 bank so I can go buy a mutual fund? They'd say, no, not going to happen. If I say, well, will you loan me $100,000 to go buy a house? They'll say, maybe. How much down will you put in? And, what's your financials? And they start the discussion. So from a bank standpoint, Robert's 100% correct. There's not going to be a bank in the world that I know of that would loan you money to buy mutual funds. Now, they might loan you some money if you have mutual funds as collateral. Maybe, I don't know. I've never tried that. But to go in with nothing, saying I'm going to borrow this money and speculate on a mutual fund, no, not at all. So when we get into the financial markets, how does that work? Well, there's something called a margin account. And, to put something like that on YouTube is a little dangerous in and of itself. So we should disclaim and to say, look, debt has risks and it increases risk because you're now creating an obligation with money you might not have. If I buy...
Andy, let me take that a little further.
If you would.
So now, Robert says debt is like a weapon, right? It can be used to protect you, or it can be used to shoot you in the foot. But I'm going to tell you a personal story. This is before I met you, before you became my teacher, my mentor. I got myself a stock account, and I found out about this margin account thing, and I was like, oh my God, that's the coolest thing ever. I'm going to be rich. And I blew it all, and I lost it all. I bet you I lost every penny in 2 weeks.
Oh my God.
All of that is because of my stupidity. I did not bother to get educated. I was trying to go, there's a hot tip. I'm going to triple down, quadruple down. I'm all in, sell my house, sell my children, the whole 9 yards. And so I am the old Greg, I should say, is the model of how debt is super dangerous. But, and I do want to give you a plug here. With your courses, and you know what, actually, I don't know the people who know how to get to your courses. If you go to our show notes, there'll be a link that lets you see Andy's courses. And a lot of Andy's courses, webinars are free on there. So if you just need some free education, go to our show notes, or you can get to his classes there. But before I took your classes, I wouldn't touch debt because I was too stupid, and I'd already shot. I didn't shoot myself in the foot. I shot myself right in the gut. But so yeah, I am the barely living example of the dangers of debt.
So when and it's important for us to disclaim that because people can blow up their account. There's margin calls and bad things that happen. So make sure we practice on paper with a paper account, practice, virtually without real money, and really understand this before you use any type of debt, real estate, business, or stocks. So, a bank might look at the volatility of the real estate market and they'll say, you know what, we need 25% down. And we feel comfortable with having 25% down. And why? Well, their risk is default, right? And so if it defaults, hopefully the price hasn't fallen further than that, 25% use, so they can get at least their money out, right? And so with the stock market, it's very much the same idea, but stocks are more volatile than real estate. So they won't give you a 75% leverage. Traditionally, they start with 50% leverage. But on the flip side, if you qualify for it, you fill out your application and get approved for a margin account, that's it. There's no credit check beyond there. If you want to use that margin, it's there like a credit card. It's just bam, you can tap it. So I like Robert's analogy. I often use fire, saying, it can cook your food, it can heat your home, it can fend off the bear, but it can also burn your house down. And it's just an accelerator, right? So when a person opens up an account, maybe they put a couple $1,000 in there to start off. They'll let you trade with $4,000 if you have a margin account. You have that line of credit.
Right. Anybody. So not an Andy Tanner.
For margin account, yeah.
Even a Greg can do that.
Greg, you can have one of these. Knowing you probably have one by the end of the day. And the reason that's dangerous is I like Robert's metaphor as well as mine is that, you would always have a safety talk. If you're a Boy Scout and you're going to get your marksmanship merit badge, you'd certainly have a safety talk before you handle that gun. And if you're going to go out and get your camping merit badge and learn how to start that fire, you certainly want to have a safety talk. And yet, if my son was stranded in the mountains, hypothermia will get you before, hunger or thirst. Freeze will get you quick. So the one skill I'd hope he would have is to start a fire, but he'd know how to respect that. So when you open up an account, you have what's called your net liquidation, which means if you sold everything and closed it up, here's how much money you take with you. But then they have what's called your buying power. And most of them will give you twice the buying power, which is important to know in and of itself because you haven't even asked for the money and it's sitting right there tempting you. And this is dangerous because the way a lot of people blow up their stock account, Greg, is they'll use a lot of leverage and be forced to close positions that they don't want to close when something bad happens. As a matter of fact, on a macro view, this is what the problem with long-term capital management was in the 90s. Bear Stearns and Lehman Brothers in 2007 and 8, and even today. So even the big Wall Street firms that think they're so smart get way over leveraged. And in the Forex, you can leverage a lot more. The foreign, it used to be 300 to 1. Not like real estate was like 3 to 1. Really, it was like 300 to 1 in Forex. So it has a lot to do with the movement of the underlying asset you're dealing with, how much money they'll loan you. So Robert is telling the truth when he says, the bank will not loan you money to go buy a mutual fund. I have never seen that happen. But if you ask the brokerage to loan you money to buy stock, they'll do that without even a separate application if you've got your margin account set up already.
It's the easiest thing you can ever do. So,
too easy, in my opinion. We've said before that paper assets has the most involvement with the least knowledge of any asset class. This is a great example of people getting themselves into trouble pretty quick. But yeah, the leverage is there if you want it.
Okay, I'm living proof of that. All right, so that is debt one, which we all kind of knew. We all understand borrowing money. Now let's
Sure.
talk about debt number two.
Well, we've talked before about short positions on this podcast. And a short position, really happens in 4 steps. You borrow something like money, you exchange it for a house, you turn it back into money via rent, and you return what you borrowed via house payment. So when you borrow money from the bank to buy real estate, you're essentially in a short position on the US dollar. A true, pure definition, wonky, all detailed. The engineers love that detail. If you're going to be in a short position, you've borrowed something. Well, you can not only borrow money in your margin account, you can also borrow stock from the brokerage. If I want to be in a short position on the dollar, I borrow $1 and trade it for something else, like real estate. If I want to be in a short position on a stock, I borrow a stock and I trade it for cash.
Okay,
And,
let's just clarify that real quick. You're borrowing
stock, shares
from a brokerage.
From a brokerage.
You're not even borrowing it from the
stock. Go ahead.
You're not borrowing it from, like if you're borrowing a Coca-Cola stock, you're not borrowing it from Coca-Cola. You're borrowing it from a middleman, your brokerage.
That's right. Think of it, it's not exactly this way, but a good way to think of it is when you borrow money from a bank, that you're borrowing money from that bank. You owe the bank that money. Now, they're taking someone else's savings and loaning it to you. Well, the same would be in a brokerage. Is thinking a brokerage is where you hold your stock holdings, right? And so think of it the same way, that you would be indebted to the brokerage for those shares. And the reason that's cool is you're borrowing shares, not money. So let's say I borrow 1 share at $100 and it goes down to 50. Well, I borrow 1 share at 100, sell it, get the $100, let it drop down to 50, buy back for 50 and return the shares. I just made $50. So another form of debt and leverage would be borrowing shares.
Okay, so you can borrow, but you borrow money to buy.
Borrow money on your margin account. Yep. Borrow shares in a short position.
Okay, now when you borrow shares, can I borrow shares, or does it have to be somebody like you, a little more elevated, a little better off financially?
Let's not elevate me too far. In fact, the first stock trade I ever made was actually a short, not a long. I took a class in Denver, Colorado 1,000 years ago, and they taught me how things worked, and it happened to be in the downturn of the year 2000 or so, something like that, 20 years ago, and the formula said just short it. And so I did, and I made like $1.40, $1.40. So there you go. That was my first trade.
So anyone can short.
Yeah, I mean, the way it works, Greg, is when you set up your account, they really get all those questions out of the way at the beginning. You go to, and it's pretty much the same in any country. I mean, different countries have different laws, but they basically say, okay, do you want an IRA where it's only retirement, or do you want a regular account? Oh, I want a standard regular account. Okay. Do you want to use this just for income strategies, holding stock, speculation? I want all of it. Speculation, income, all of it. Okay, do you want a margin account? Okay, yes, I do. And based on your experience and your income, and they get all that out of the way. But I would say most people, if you can qualify for a basic car loan, you could qualify for a margin account, and you could short stocks. And like we said, it's good and it's bad. It's good in that if a person knew what he was doing, or she could set it up pretty quick. But the problem is, if she didn't know what she was doing, she could set up pretty quick. And so they do enough to cover themselves. You have to say, hey, I have this much experience or what have you. But to tell the truth, my first, it was a company called Daytech. They're not around anymore. But I said, Daytech, I want a margin account. I want all this fancy stuff. They said, well, you don't have the experience in trading. I said, well, okay, I'm here to gain experience. Could you recommend another brokerage where I could gain that experience? They said, oh, we'll give you the margin account. So it's not guaranteed that you'd get one right out of the gate. And you'd always be honest in how you've been. But most people can get their hands on one pretty quickly if they want.
Okay, I'm going to say margin account is the easiest. anyone can do it. I'm just say
like a basic standard account would be easiest with no margin, right? I mean, that'd be just like getting a savings account. That's pretty easy.
But anyone can get a margin account, but it does require at least a little education or a willingness to lie about your education before you can borrow stocks. Is that fair?
And certainly not a lie. We wouldn't want that in any case.
No. I'm not saying we would do that. I'm just saying it could.
Have people done it? I'm sure they have. The brokers just want us to make sure that they're covered, right? Go through the questions, and if they say, no, we won't give you a margin account, you can call them up and say, what would I need to do to get one? And they'll tell you.
All right, so we've covered two kinds of debt. We've covered really money, and we've covered stocks.
Money and
now we want to talk about the third.
Yeah, and this is a little bit different where we transition into a very important jargon where we talk about leverage. Because people make a mistake, Greg, and they use those two synonymously, which is incorrect. So this might be the most valuable part of this podcast, because when I say, oh, that guy's highly leveraged, man, he's way highly leveraged. What does that usually mean to someone? I'd say, oh, some of those Wall Street firms, they were highly leveraged. What that often means is they just assume they were all in debt.
Yeah.
But there's leverage of lots of different things. For example, if a person has 500 employees, is he leveraged? Yeah, he's got 500 people working on his dream. That's a great lever. He's levering people's time, talent. We often call these, in my book, I call it the OPE, which is other people's everything. Other people's energy, other people's experience, other people's education, other people's enthusiasm, other people's all those E's, that's a form of leverage. So in the stock market, generally, there's people that use margin. I certainly have used margin in the past, but not a lot. Generally, I don't like to borrow money. I like to find my leverage through contracts. And you can put yourself, so what is a lever? A lever is when you move something big with something little. Give me a lever long enough and I can move the whole world. So a lever is when we're doing something big with something small. Buckminster Fuller talks about ephemeralization, where you try to do more with less and more with less until eventually you can do everything with nothing, is the idea, right?
Right.
And so one of the things that we use to get tremendous leverage in the stock market is the options market. And there's two sides of that, the buy side and the sell side. Let's talk about the buy side for a moment. That gives you, huge amounts of leverage, sometimes 100 to 1 without going into debt. And so that's a really appealing idea to people to say, wait. I can have leverage, but no debt. So let's go back to debt and real estate, because this is an idea.
I didn't understand that. I'm sorry. Can you explain that? You said some leverage and 100 to 1, and this is if you're the buyer.
Yeah, think about this. Think about this.
Who are you buying it from?
Well, let's back up and try to make it a little bit simple. The word choice is a powerful word. When you have choices, you have power. When you have no choices, you don't have power. So let's just think for a moment that if I put $25,000 down on a property and I finance 75, I now control the property. So the leverage means I didn't have to spend the whole 100,000 out of my pocket to control the property. I only had to spend 25,000. Does that at least make sense to the average person, you think?
Absolutely.
So what's cool is you now have the choice to sell that property, don't you?
Yes.
So let's say you bought it for 100,000 and it goes up to 125,000. What can you do? You have the choice. You could hold it or you could sell it and you double your money, wouldn't you?
Right.
Because you only put down 25,000. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
So what an option is, let's start with something called a call option, and that'll be sufficient for our conversation on debt, is let's say, for example, I say there's a stock for $100. And instead of like a real estate deal where I say, I'll give you $25 down and borrow the other 75, it doesn't work that way. I say, you know what, I'll give you $2 now for the choice to buy at 100 if I want to over the next month or so, something like that. And so for $2, I now control $100 worth of stock and I have no debt. And so now the most I could lose in that deal is $2. So even the stock went down half, like to $50. I don't have that $50 liability. I say, oh, no, thank you. I don't think I want to buy it. And I lose $2. Or if it goes to $102, I've just doubled my money. So it's very similar. Robert will often say, you know, a down payment on a house is kind of like an option. Difference though with house is, let's say that home for $100,000 drops 25 grand. Well, now if you sell it, you know, you're on the hook, right? You've not only made no money, you've lost everything you have in the down payment. So the nice thing about an option is I get the same leverage of control, but I don't have any obligations whatsoever. And my maximum risk is that premium that I paid. So there are stocks right now, I like more than a month. So I might pay $5 for an option for 3 months to buy a $100 stock. If the stock, you know, if I were to spend the $100 for the stock and it drops half, I've just lost $50. But the maximum you can lose when you buy an option is $5. Now, this is what people are going to say, why doesn't everybody do it that way? Well, if I buy a stock and it goes down, I can always wait for it to come back up long term. But options have a time limit on them, and that's where your risk is that time decays, and your chances of losing all your money are greater. There's a chance of that, you know, stock staying at 100 or lower, and I lose my whole premium. You know, it didn't go up.
Right.
So that's the trade-off. It's more about the time and the risk there than it is about how much you've borrowed, you know, in real estate.
Okay.
Does that make sense, Paul?
Yeah. Now, you ready for this one? Greg's greed is totally kicking in here.
Your greed, yes.
Okay. This, you know.
Calm, Greg. Calm.
Let's just be honest. Greg's a greedy bastard.
Breathe.
Right. So I put my $1 down and I get my option. And
yes.
it's going good. Like I want to exercise my option. Now I throw in my margin account and I double what I wanted to buy.
Are you asking if you can do it?
Can I do that?
Unfortunately, you can. Yeah, you could. You have what's called option power, option buying power. So just like you have a stock buying power, you also have an option buying power, and they're gonna. And actually that can change based on experience, size of account. There's not a standard I would give you on that. But the answer is, yeah, you can actually use your margin account to buy your option on the stock, which would give you a lever on the lever. And what's really frightening is we won't get into, you can get about as much leverage as you could ever want as you grow and advance. And I think the big picture question is this: can I use debt as an accelerator? Is there leverage available for me in stocks? And the answer is yes. The question is how much risk is there in those types of things? What this conversation usually comes down to is something like this, and why people would subscribe to see a video or, you know, click on something to see a video like this, is compounding is money, rate, and time. And if people don't have a lot of money and they don't have a lot of time, what does that leave you left with? Rate. So they're always asking, hey, Andy, in your programs, you know, what kind of rate can I expect to get? And I'm saying, you know, 0. Just assume that. You know, I don't want the liability, because a person can strive for as much rate as they want to do, all the way up to infinite return. The problem with that is, though, is do they understand the risk part and the education associated with those aggressive positions? You know, Warren Buffett gets a great return, but I wouldn't put my mother in the, you know, derivatives that he sells and the promises he makes, and she doesn't understand that stuff, right? Wouldn't put her in those. And
let me just help your soul a little bit here.
Thank you, because you can tell I have a heart attack. My biggest fear, and you've known me for how many years, Greg? Years and years and years. You know, my biggest fear is that a student would get excited and feel his greed glands and do something to hurt themselves without first investing in their education properly. breathing, taking it slow. It's like a guy that wants to fly in an airplane his first day. Like, oh, I got this. I drove a car. How hard can it be? Let's go. Well,
Andy, you're talking to that guy. You are talking to that guy. So, to help your soul, when I take your class, I do want to acknowledge that when I take your class, you have your 4 pillars class. That fourth pillar is, even though it's the fourth pillar, it really is the one you talk about most. And that pillar, I find that you've weaved through the other 3 pillars, and that's risk management, because you are so concerned with protecting your students.
Yeah, well, I know the risk.
Yeah,
right?
you really do. So Andy, I will not.
Okay,
Today,
thank you. Well, you understand, when I first started, I had my opportunity to blow up my account, so I know what those devastating losses feel like. Hey, and I've been doing this a long time, and I still have losses from time to time. It's not as bad as it used to be back in the day.
Sure.
But I want to make sure people understand what they're doing for sure. So think about that. You've got a margin account to borrow money to buy stocks. You've got the ability to borrow stocks to profit when they go down. And you also have the ability to buy options, which are very, very small. I mean, think about controlling a $100 stock for $5. That's good leverage without debt, without going into debt where your maximum risk is the premium you pay. That's very appealing to people. The problem with that is now my stock's got to go up at least $105 to cover that. Well, that's a 5% increase before I start making money, and that doesn't happen every day. So there's always give and take. There's not a whole lot of shortcuts without education. But just like I'd say in real estate, you wouldn't want to borrow $1 million unless you knew what you were doing, because you're on the hook for that $1 million. So it's a great opportunity to learn about leverage, debt, doing big things with small things, but also managing the risks that are there.
So, Andy, I think you just did my job, and that's where you really just summarized the entire show right there. But I'm going to help you out then, since you just helped me out and took my work away.
All right, sorry, I stole the thunder there, buddy.
We're good. Anyone who really does want to learn risk management and these other things, such as how to use debt properly in the stock, go to our show notes. You can learn from Andy. You can learn from Andy free, or you can take Andy's courses. It's whatever option fits your learning style best, but also your budget best. So
appreciate
there you go. That's right. My thank you for doing my job.
Thank you for the plug. I appreciate it, Greg. And as always, I love you and your family and the whole team at Rich Dad is just awesome. So thank you.
Right back at you. We'll see you next week, Andy.
Bye-bye.
Bye.